Hi there, testing the mic. Okay. Hi there. So I'm Jordan, Executive Director of the newly formed nonprofit BuildSoil. And we've been streaming off and on all this week to do some introductory talk and to get used to the technology of Twitch. And today we're going to be looking at a slideshow and talking about some ideas around climate change, some ideas around ways of approaching climate change and thinking about climate change. And specifically, we're going to talk about why chestnuts might be a good solution for a lot of us. We're not going to go too deep into chestnuts. We will be having, throughout the season and throughout the year, we're going to be having more focused lessons on planting, selecting, identifying community efforts for chestnuts, cooking chestnuts, those kinds of things. No, we're already getting some people signing up. This is awesome. So please, join us and subscribe. We now can subscribe and follow in order to get alerts about other presentations that are happening. I think we're going to move into a rhythm of about two a week, and we're going to be alternating between light topics, reviewing some of the stuff that's been talked about before in our Twitter, and also starting to move forward on our curriculum. We may be doing a permaculture design course kind of curriculum for free, so a little light and a little bit of play and a little bit of looking at different topics. And we may also choose some other stuff too. Now, in the corner, I've put a QR code to join our Discord. So, if you want to use your camera and join our Discord, we have now we have about 500 people who are coming together and starting to organize themselves around the different stages of chestnut planting, but also around other kinds of climate change and food issues. And we've also organized around ecoregions so that people can find people in their own community, their own town, and their own ecoregion who might have different plants than chestnuts or other kinds of approaches that they want to take. So just before I get started, let me look. We have a lot of people joining us today, and I just want to say how grateful that I am to have all of you in community and to be working on stuff together. I recognize a lot of the names as people who we actually are working together on the Discord and in other spaces. So that's great. One thing we're looking at our Discord is starting to have group discussions. So sometime towards the end of February, we may have a gathering of everybody who wants to and start talking through, what are the stages? What are the processes? What are the difficulties that some of us have? Because we're all in different situations. So what works for us here in Portland might be a little different than somebody in Austin or somebody in New England, whether your climate is becoming more hospitable to food production or whether it's maybe becoming more and more challenging, you're going to have to deal with slightly different issues. So I think we should get started. Now, I really have been enjoying this aspect of Twitch that people can talk. So please join the chat and ask questions and comment. I may or may not give energy to that, but it's always nice to have the feedback. So let's get started. Sorry, I have to change something about our window. Here we go. Oh, hi there, Botanic Biophilia. Yeah, we made the Twitch, and a number of the discussions are already on the stream library. Of course, those are only going to last for about 15 days, and so I've been just copying them raw over to our YouTube, which is it's simple, BuildSoil. Everything's BuildSoil. And I will be also trying to cut those up into smaller. One of them is about 2.5 hours, and it's definitely could be broken up into 3. So we'll do that. Okay, I want to start with this presentation. 1 million chestnuts for carbon and food. And like I said, if you want to join our Discord, here's a way to do that. And I could also drop a link. I don't have one on me right now, but if you focus on this, drop the link, and you can join us on that. All right, let's get started. So I think one of the things that we deal with in living in the era that we currently live in is that most of the knowledge we have about climate change and most of the ways that we hear about it and most of the ways that we develop certainty around it are global models. They're looking at the big picture, and I think they're necessarily looking at the big picture. We need to be able to show global, large scale, rather than local change, right? Weather is not climate change, and you can have changes in weather without changes in the overall climate of the planet, the overall warming of the planet. Climate is the replication of pattern of weather, of site conditions, and that is variable. There's already a variability in climate, and there's a variability in all sorts of stuff. So we have to be aware that, like, as things change, as the globe heats up, we have to look at those things. So when we build these models, though, necessarily we have to simplify them. And so, if you look back at old IPCC reports from just like a decade ago, they really didn't include land use as a factor. Those of us who have been involved in issues of soil, we know that that's one of the largest pools of carbon on the planet. And we know that soil loss is astronomical. Like it's terrible. And so there's no way that it's not a big contributor to climate change. And then we would see these IPCC reports and they wouldn't have it on there. And I started talking with climate scientists, and they're like, well, this is the thing. In order for models to work, we have to build black boxes. We can't double account. We don't want to accidentally make models that start spitting extra carbon that doesn't actually exist into the model. And so you do that by measuring where you can measure, and we can measure in the air. So those models don't necessarily inherently describe, like every little tiny action that people are taking. They just can't. And they're actually extraordinarily accurate and useful without doing that. If you start trying to add too many variables, the thing falls apart. So more and more over the last decade, we've been seeing soil and climate change as an accounted for and understood aspect of those reports. And every year it's a little bit more. And that doesn't mean that they're correcting themselves in terms of their belief and their proof that climate change is happening. It just means that we're in a period where we're having to start to ask the questions of like, what are the things that are adding up? Like, how do we actually on the ground make changes? So years ago, I was thinking about the frog in the boiling pot of water, how gradual changes, we all sort of adapt to them until it's too late. And I think it's a good idea for catastrophic change and big issues to know where you stand and know where your edges are. And I made a pledge with myself and my friends. And I said, basically, I'm going to keep track of drought and I'm going to keep track of the climate. And if things are ever as bad as the Dust Bowl again, I have no more excuses. I can't live the life I thought I was going to live. I'm going to devote myself towards trying to repair things. If we ever hit a Dust Bowl event again. Well, in 2016, we did. And first, it was the area that the Dust Bowl had happened before. It was, the Great Basin, and it was Oklahoma, and it was like North Texas, and those areas got there again. Oh, hey, kid. Kid has been like one of my big mentors in getting like the tech side of this together and just sort of like understanding how this stuff works. So I totally recommend going and following him too. He does a lot of politics and really intense plague-based video games. Anyway. So thinking about the issue of the Dust Bowl, like here we go back in the 1930s, this image, this is what was happening. So people moved out into the Oklahoma Panhandle region because they were promised these vast landscapes of soil, and they went and they farmed and they made a life. And almost, a decade or two later, there was this drought. And it turns out these droughts happen from time to time. They are regular processes. But they are also coming more and more with climate change, right? Those weak points in the ecosystem. And so the combination of tillage agriculture, settlement, overplowing, and a philosophy that was really based on turning over soil, they took a place that was not like England and it was not like New England, and they tried to apply an agricultural method that just was not going to work, So the topsoil blew in the wind, right? And so thick that it became black in the skies of DC. And there was a lot of news about this, partially because people went and documented it and took photographs. And there was also the fact that there had been this big sort of like push, a couple decades before to go farm it. So I think people had recent memory and they made connections between those things. Yeah, this was happening all over the Dust Bowl, these gigantic blowing in the wind. So anyway, this is the beginning of my presentation is like the problems, right? So here we go. We know the problems. We know that the annual average temperature, it's going up and up and up. We know that CO2 levels are going up and up and up. And we know that we are headed towards, bad places. And I actually don't always feel the need to go too deep into it because we are inundated with the truth that this is happening. But let's just recognize, as of the last measurement I saw was January 20th, we're at 417 parts per million, which is, how many molecules of the air are carbon dioxide. And look, only a year ago we were at 415, so we're just sort of like, inching our way up. Global temperatures have gone up 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. That's huge when you're talking about a climate system. Think about how long it takes to boil a pot of water with a flame. Well, that's, just to bring up temperature of an entire planet. Arctic ice loss is 13% per decade right now. Land ice loss is 413 gigatons per year. Sea level gains are 0.13 inches per year. So the sea level is starting to creep up. So we're in a rough spot. I try to approach everything with a full systems understanding, and permaculture happens to do a really good job of integrating what's actually the trophic levels of ecosystems with ethics. And so I agree that permaculture teaches that all cultures that are permanent, that have some degree of permanence, because permaculture is the study of permanence and the cultures that have permanence. It's not the inventor of a design, right? It's the study of those designs that have lasted. And the three ethics are care for the earth, care for the people, and redistribute the surpluses. But these are philosophies also of how we use our time and energy. So the first priority of anything is to take care of the systems that support us. We take care of the soil, we take care of the vegetation, we take care of the house, we take care of the infrastructure. And then using that energy that collects, we're able to grow food, we're able to grow resources, we're able to take care of things. And we use that immediately to take care of people. That's the second ethic, that we use what we've created, we use what we've built to take care of people. And then there's always some extra, if we're lucky, and we use that to take care of the system again. First to take care of the earth and take care of people. And if we keep doing that, we build a stronger and stronger ecology. And that includes the ecology of people. Somebody's saying that water is not a limiting factor currently in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, I might not be able to go too deep into big questions right now, but I'll go back and look at these and so we can answer them in the future. I would argue that we actually are in a brittle environment where that gets dry during the middle of the year, and that we actually have a lot of the same problems, especially because the climate in Portland, Oregon, as climate moves 20 kilometers a year, the climate in Portland is aiming to be about the same climate as Sacramento and Yuba and that area, and that is really similar to Jerusalem and parts of Syria. So we are going to be in a desert, brittle environment within the next couple decades. And maybe a few spots like, central or northern western BC and next to the water, those places are going to be more like Cascadian kind of ecosystems. So what's happening? Well, there's a natural cycle, right, of CO2, and there's a natural cycle of temperature. But that's been completely changed. So for the last many epochs, we've been in this interglacial, glacial period where there's an ice age that goes between a period where relatively the glaciers are staying up on the tops of mountains and near the poles. And then there's periods where the glaciers come down and enter into valleys and move farther south or farther north on the southern hemisphere. So at the same time, we've been rapidly converting stored energy and energy supplies, and the ability of like rock to have isotopes to be ready to be broken, or the storages of fossil plants underground, or the phytoplankton that have been pushed and mushed by mountain ranges and plate tectonics. We're just like moving through it as we industrialize and as we put more and more of our society towards that, in order to also deal with some of the effects like we were talking about yesterday with rivers and river ecosystems. So this consumption, this energy, we think of it a lot in terms of like fuel use. So we know that if we burn oil, it releases CO2, and that has effects on the atmosphere. But this is also energy, and it's work, and we're using that work to do things, right? So it's a slow motion explosion. The amount of crude oil already used since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is about the same amount of energy released in 90 million of the original atomic bomb. So that means each day globally, because it's been peaking, right now at the rate that we're using of barrels of oil per day, that's the same amount of energy as 8,496 atom bombs a day. And what are we doing with that energy? We're flinging it at the earth. We're using it to rip up soil. We're using it to manufacture ores. We're using it to light our homes. We're using it to push together different kinds of molecules and create different kinds of structures and to grow human beings and to grow agriculture. But that energy is being bombarded into the planet in one form or another. Even right now, the energy that's allowing the light in this room, that's holding up these walls through the construction processes that are heating my house, the light that's bouncing off of me to this camera, the manufacturing of that camera, the energy that's maintaining the signal that's sending all the way back to you through massive machinery, coding and programming and storing and accessing databases. All of that is energy that is being released and thrust through the planet. So no wonder we're in a rough situation when there's 8,500 atom bombs thrown at the planet a day in order to sustain this civilization. And that amount of energy, so far from crude oil, is 1/100th of the energy that the impact of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So it's much, it's a slower process, but really it's only been a couple hundred years of this, right? And it's only really been the last 100 years of this. And so it's not really that much slower than something 100 times bigger, slamming into the planet. And so I think there are parallels to be made through the massive energy that happened with that kind of, asteroid impact, just like that movie that's been out recently, and the ongoing constant energy output that's just raging through us. So one of the main things that we do with the energy is we turn over the soil. We keep moving soil over and over again. And at the same time, we also keep doing things like running machinery over. Now, we're trying to do techniques like non-tillage, and those are, they have their benefits. But in a lot of ways, the way we do non-tillage also requires still the manufacturing of fertilizers, which is a huge amount of energy to take that triple bonded nitrogen and rip it open in order to attach it to oxygen and make some kind of, fertilizer that plants can use. So and then those nitrogen, 80% of it ends up washing out anyway because it's water soluble and ends up in waterways and into the oceans, and that causes dead zones. So that energy impact is there in a lot of other ways in the form of these salts moving through the aquifers and down into the sea and causing hypoxia and hydrogen sulfide gas starting to form and those kinds of things. So we're just taking a huge amount of energy and we're just tearing over the planet over and over again. Every season we're doing this, right? So when we think about events like the Dust Bowl, in 2016, with events like the Dust Bowl happening everywhere, there was a massive drop of soil. And back in 2016, when the drought had moved all the way to California, and then it got big news, when it was, in an area that nobody was paying attention to, it was not really talked about much. But as soon as it hit California and really affected in 2016, I was driving down the 5 and noticing all the landscape. And, it looked kind of dry. It was rough, but then I kept noticing that newish houses were sitting on tufts of soil, sort of like this one here, that they were on top, and then there was drop, and you could see this fence post, fairly new fence posts, maybe only 10 years old, and they were on clear tufts of soil. And what was happening is that the ground was being taken out from under. And you can go and see the effects of places like this. After the Dust Bowl, there was a lot of documentation that was done because we really started to get serious about soil conservation for a while. And this is an incredible loss of soil. So this all is soil that originally was getting turned over and over again by these plows. And the reason why you turn soil, there's a couple of reasons. One is so it's loose so that you can plant in it. But the other is that one of the ways soil works is that it is a process by which microbes grow. And these microbes are fungi and they are bacteria. And those fungi and bacteria need the nutrients. And they get it from rock, but they need fuel. So the plants give them carbon, give them food, and they use that energy. In exchange for it, they mine the soil and grab from the rocks and make soluble forms of nutrients and give it back to the well, actually, at first they hold on to it, and then nematodes and protozoa come and eat them, and they have the ability to eliminate the way we do. So when they are done processing food, their wastes are perfectly suited for plant use. They're nitrogen and phosphorus and all those things, right? And one of the things that happens is a lot of our crops are adapted to a certain balance of fungi, and they're adapted to a certain balance of bacteria. When you plow soil for annual crops, you create the conditions where you're just mixing up stuff. You're breaking fungal webs. You're taking things that normally were locked up in the soil, and there's a nutrient release. And that causes a bacterial bloom. Good bacteria, they bloom. And in that bloom is all of this like increased nutrient flow. And that's where we grow, all those annual crops. But that release of energy is also a massive respiratory event. Like they breathe, they're eating carbon and breathing out carbon dioxide. And you can actually see carbon release happening around the planet every spring and summer as the organisms are like coming to life and digesting the stored organic matter and breathing it out into carbon dioxide. So tillage is accelerating those processes. But one of the other effects is that we break apart the ability of soil to hold itself together, the structure of soil. And that's why it begins to wash away, or it begins to blow away in these kinds of events. So in 2015, 2016, during this drought, the exact same things. I mean, this does happen from time to time in cities like Phoenix, but the extent that was happening during that time, and then since then, increasing events like this, large dust storms. This is topsoil. Though actually in this point, some of it's subsoil, but this is soil blowing into the air. Oh, that's interesting. I would love to learn more about that game. Maybe we'll play it sometime. Maybe we could do a playing of it. I should read what people are saying. So Botanical Biophilia says, I was just starting the game on Steam called Secrets of Soil that was talking about protozoa and nematodes. Yeah, understanding that structure is interesting, and I'm so curious about the idea of a game kind of being built about that. Let me see. Okay, so this is still happening. Look, here's Phoenix, Arizona. Topsoil. Soil blowing in the air. And it's crazy. I should have found a video of it. There's a video from this time where they sent out, some news team down here sent out a weather reporter. And there's this poor woman, and she's standing in a dust storm. Like the stuff you hear about when you're hearing about the Dust Bowl. And she's just like defending against it, and it's like scouring her. And she's just like, yeah, the dust's pretty bad out here. And like the news people are making jokes the way that they do on like a big rain, And I'm like, this is nightmare. This is a nightmare scenario, because that's like the planet, right? So soil erosion and degradation. Here's some stats from the World Wildlife Fund. Half of the topsoil on the planet has been lost in the last 150 years, and it's accelerating. In addition to erosion, soil quality is affected by other aspects of agriculture. These impacts include compaction, loss of soil structure, nutrient degradation, and soil salinity. These are very real and at times severe issues, right? So soil ends up being this thing that sort of like is a rubric for understanding the way that other processes are affecting it. And it's also a way, it also has like compounding effects on so many other systems. If the soil isn't holding water, you get flashy events and you get the drop of water tables. If the soil isn't able to be nutrient rich enough, it's not able to support communities. And if it starts getting too salty, it becomes deflocculated, which is it loses its physical structure and actually starts just like sinking and flattening. Soil degradation is everywhere. And it's been in different places for a long, long time too. Like there's records of some of the impetus behind the Revolutionary War was that they treated soil so poorly in New England over the colonial period that they were wanting to move to new landscapes because the soils were getting degraded, and Britain wasn't allowing them to move on past the proclamation line, right? So, and we also know that soil loss occurred in ancient Egypt and was the impetus for the beginning of reestablishing forestry and the first foresters. And there was also huge soil loss as the cedars of Lebanon and the forests of Iraq were lost. And soil's no joke. So here's a graphic of atmospheric carbon net annual increase, right? So like there's atmospheric carbon is increasing at this level of 4, and plants take, through photosynthesis, they take energy from light and they use it to grab CO2. They run their own biology, they run their own bodies, and so out of every 120 units, they put out 60 units. I think this is gigatons. Yeah, this is gigatons of carbon per year. So 60 gigatons of carbon per year are required in order to run plants. And then the plants put a lot of it in their biomass over time, and they've begun to store 550 gigatons on the planet currently is within the bodies of plants. But actually plants use most of their energy in the form of that pass-through, which isn't listed here. So we know that for a lot of like more advanced plants, 50 to 80% of their photosynthesis goes towards the output of sugars, proteins, and carbohydrates. Proteins, they have to add a little bit of nitrogen to the thing, actually a lot of nitrogen. No, you're not derailing me at all. I love all these questions. And also I go back and it makes me think about things I want to answer in the future or things I want to research if I haven't thought too much about them. What was I saying though? Oh, so 50 to 80% of the photosynthesis and that carbon goes to the manufacturing of sugar, protein, and carbohydrates. And one of my mentors, Elaine Ingham, always says, well, what is sugar, protein, and carbohydrates? It's eggs, butter, flour, right? And what is that? That's cake. That's cookies. So they're feeding delicious like protein and carbs and sugars to the microbes. And those microbes grow, they mine the resources that they can't get from the air, and they give that to the plants over time through those processes we were talking about. And over time, soil currently stores, in this chart, it's saying 2,300 gigatons of storage. I actually am not sure if that number is right. I should be, it's time for me to sit down and recalibrate and recalculate some of this stuff for myself. And that's nothing to laugh at when the overall fossil pool is 10,000. So it's interesting because this soil process is actually relatively quick, both in its rapid loss and in the potential that we have for rapid gain. Now you hear statistics that say that an inch of soil takes 1,000 years to form. And what that's really describing is the entire process, right, of a natural soil in an environment on average, having to turn from bedrock, pulverize over time through weathering, through all sorts of stuff. And eventually it, becomes a medium that plants are able to inject nutrients into, and organisms like microbes are able to eventually colonize. But soil does such a good job of protecting the subsoil that actually that process is sort of like runs for a while and slows as it protects and becomes almost like an armoring for the soil. So we have to come up with ways of actually helping the subsoils get inoculated quicker. And a lot of the techniques that are out there for regenerative agriculture, as well as soil-based sequestration, they are focused on this question of how do we speed up the process that subsoil could be transformed into topsoil. Just like flour can be added, this isn't, flour, you can add yeast and eventually it becomes bread. We could do the same thing where the subsoil on the planet is still there, even though we've lost most of our topsoils. So we could be transforming the subsoils as a medium for storage and also transformation of carbon. So over time, higher and higher plants over successional processes, they need a little bit more fungi. So if you ever go to a garden store, good. I'm glad you're taking Elaine's course. I spent a month in her kitchen looking down a microscope, and it was life-changing. She's an incredible teacher. I recommend her work a lot. I hope you're liking it. Does biochar help with the transformation of subsoil? So I'm a biochar, I'm not a skeptic, but I think biochar needs to be considered in accurate time and place. What we now know is that all soils require a tiny bit of char. Like most soils require a little bit of that. We know biochar as a knowledge that was taken from Amazonia, right? From cultures in Amazonia that have transformed, natural, non-intervened wetlands or tropical soils can often be really poor because they can wash out really quick. So plants tend to hold nutrients in their own bodies. But we know that places where people live, they worked with a very like intentional form of slash and burn, where they would cut back vegetation and let it smolder so that it doesn't all turn into ash. And that smoldered char gets buried and it transforms soils in the tropics incredibly well. It creates a lot of like little fractal sites that microbes can colonize and can do their work in. It gets, I think, overplayed in in temperate environments. Our soils don't really love having added biochar beyond a certain point. So what I tend to recommend is already you should have a fire regime. Why not do control burns? Why not do that? Why not have fire be part of your natural cycle of how you're dealing with landscapes? But in compost also does a lot of that and does a lot of the acceleration for us. So we don't have to think as much about char. But a little bit of char and a piece of land that has not been taken care of very well, I would say like an initial application of char and then wait a decade, wait 3 years and then look, and then wait 5 years and then look. You don't need to overdo it. That's my take. So in that little window with that little opportunity, biochar is an incredible facilitator of necessary soil processes. So over time, plants, if you go to a garden store and you've got different plants, they might tell you that you need different kinds of plant food. And it turns out that ammonium is useful for trees and conifers and some of the more plants that you think of as being in a forest. And nitrogen is more the focus for the early. And part of that's connected to the fact that bacteria are just better. They flow with nitrogen. They flow with nitrates, and fungi are more, putting things in the form of ammonium, and so a fungal soil tends to be more balanced like that. So you can also see and look at a piece of landscape, and you can tell something about what's the fungal bacterial balance. If you're looking and your garden is constantly picking and putting up pioneer plants, putting up a lot of different kinds of weeds, and you keep putting in vegetables and they're not thriving, and these early succession are, and maybe you're like kale, it's doing okay, but your other vegetables aren't. There's a good chance that you have a soil that's a little bit too bacterial, and so adding woody material and shifting things in that direction is probably like your best bet. So being able to understand the soil's dynamics is how soils actually control the movement of chemistry, then actually control what kind of plants are suited for a place. And over time, that process happens naturally, that shifting from a more bacterial dominated to fungal dominated. So here's a beautiful book, Life in the Soil, a food web pyramid that shows that in 1 square meter of soil, you might have a single vertebrate, but you have, what is that? That's 1,000, million, billion, 10 trillion bacteria and acetomicetes. And they support a little bit smaller population of protozoa and nematodes, and then higher and higher, larger and larger organisms, less and less. But a single square meter of soil, contains an incredible amount of diversity and life and adaptation. So this is what's beneath our feet. And that's the thing, is that a lot of times when you ask somebody to draw a plant, like draw grass, draw a tree, people don't draw the root systems. They just look at the tops. And for a lot of plants, half the plant is underground. More than half the plant for grasses, right? So these perennial grasses, here's a museum exhibit that was going around the country a couple of years ago. Perennial grasses have these incredible root systems. Some of our perennial grasses in the west part of North America, they can live 500, 600 years. And those deep root systems help them, create gigantic pools of nutrients for themselves, and it allows them to be doing incredible amount of transactions. And so when you're looking at the top parts of the plants, that's just their feeding, right? They're trying to gather sunlight, and then it's their reproduction. They're trying to make flowers and spread pollen and receive pollen. And so when you're thinking about these plants, there's something so much deeper. And then comparing this to like an annual grass, which only grows every year and only grows a tiny root system. We're dealing with really different kinds of landscapes and really different kinds of systems. People ask me sometimes about if trees or grasses are like the right thing. Should we be doing grasses? Should we be doing trees? And we'll have to talk about this more at some point, but the truth is that every single piece of landscape has its own conditions, right? It has its own landscape position. It has its own aspect and relationship to sunlight, wind. It has its own soil types. It has its own challenges and disturbance regimes and fires and predation, or grazing and predation. Like all these patterns are different place to place. And they're facing different challenges with climate change. And so the truth is, in a lot of places, trees actually are a great solution. You know, if you do a direct calculation of board feed and how much carbon that is, trees may not add up to being like the best solution. And if you're doing massive monoculture tree plantations with nothing else, you may not actually be helping a forest grow. And so you're not optimizing what trees do as transformers of ecosystems. When you use a tree as an agent of transformation in ecologies, you're doing far more than when you just plant a bunch of trees and optimize one need. Ecosystems never optimize one need, and they tend to fail if you try to. But then in a lot of landscapes, grasslands are absolutely necessary. Now, grasslands require a couple of things. They require healthy landscapes. They require proper relationship with grazers, and they also require making sure that rivers aren't incising so that there's enough of a water table for them to reach down to. And they also require things like trees on the coasts, because trees can grab water and move that water inland so that it's available for grasses to utilize. So I got this graph from David Montgomery, who's a professor of geology and soils at UW, though he may have gone emeritus at this point. He's written a couple amazing books, and I annotated this. So what this is describing is this is a log graph of, let's see, I gotta get the, this is a log graph. So every one of these steps is actually a factor of 10, right? 1, 10, 100. So it's not, so what this is describing is if we look at agricultural landscapes, alpine glaciated landscapes, which is like up in the mountains, soil mantled and cratons are basically lowland landscapes. They're the areas that we tend to do agriculture. So what this is saying is if we do agriculture on these lowland soils, we are shifting the erosion rate up to about the same as in alpine and glaciated environments. So as we're basically taking the land, this like rich soil deposit, and we are like cranking it up at an angle, and it's being washed away at the same rate that, you know, the way that rubble, when you go up into a mountain, the way that like rocks are just being moved, dirt is being created and moved fast, mountains are being worn down. So we are actually, by doing agriculture, we're shifting the balance of soil development versus soil erosion, right? There's this balance. We talked yesterday about the balance of erosion versus deposition in rivers. The same thing's true on landscapes. Soil processes that build soil versus soil processes that erode them. And we want to feed ourselves. So we have channeled a huge amount of landscape into human food, human residence, material acquiring, mining, and we are shifting the balance to a planet that is actively leaking carbon from one that was actively storing. And you can see this, a lot of like people in the farming community who are like trying to teach people to have better soil practices. They do these things where they show runoff. Runoff increases when you don't take care of the landscape, and improving tilling by going into non-tillage does a ton to reduce the amount of runoff that's happening, all those particles. So here's some facts. 1 part per million of CO2 in the atmosphere equals 7.8 gigatons of CO2, which is about 2.13 gigatons of carbon, of actual carbon. So CO2 versus carbon, right? Because in order to turn carbon into CO2, or to measure the carbon in CO2, CO2 has 2 oxygen, 2 oxygen and 1 carbon, and we're weighing the carbon part of that, right? Which is what gets taken out and turned into things that are like physical carbon on the ground. So 100 parts per million of CO2, which is really would take us back to pre-climate change conditions is about 213 gigatons of carbon. If I got these facts wrong, please let me know, because like this is stuff I looked up like 5 years ago, and so it's always good to go back and cite these things. What that means is that the soil organic matter needed to sequester 100 parts per million is about 367 gigatons of soil organic matter. That's just literally like the part of soil that contains carbon. So 49 tons per person, that's like the human population, right? It means that there's 100,000 pounds of soil organic matter per person that needs to happen in order for us to like undo the amount of CO2 that's caused climate change. And we look at these pasture soils that they currently hold like 38 tons per hectare or 15 tons per acre. So there's a lot of folks out there trying to oh, this is not working for the let me move this so that people can actually see what I'm referring to. There we go. So here's a study from Ratan Lal, who is a soil scientist who's been focusing on increasing understanding of like how much carbon is actually, happening and how much has been released due to soil loss. And his argument is that a range somewhere between 66 gigatons and 90 gigatons has been released due to soil loss. And I would say that's conservative, because we know that soil loss has been going on for a long time and it's accelerating and it's often unmeasured. But that ranges somewhere between 31% and 42% of the problem of climate change. So that's a lot. That's like a third to nearly a half, right? So that means without that soil loss, we'd be somewhere at 376 to 365 ppm. And, like the rallying call of a lot of people is 350. So where would we be had we maintained soils? And where would we be had we used soils, or if we'd been based on a agricultural or cultural system that increased soil over time and had the technology that could increase soil production over time? We could be improving the amount of soil, the volume of soil on the planet above natural levels, and we could have been buffering and dealing with a lot of this problem to begin with. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be right now doing everything we can, because we've lost so much soil, we don't have the capacity. And so we need to be using every possible tool, including the reduction of fossil fuel use. And we should be focusing our remaining fossil fuel use on things that redesign the world in order to tip the scales back towards the sequestration of carbon in healthy soils. Okay, I know what I was trying to do here. So we have this pattern of regular ice age cycles, and there's been work by climate scientists around this thing called the Rudiment Hypothesis. And I wouldn't say it's the only theory of anthropogenic climate change, but it's, as far as I know at this point, there keeps being new evidence to suggest that Rudiment's hypothesis is right. And what Rudiment did is he looked at the natural variation of things like the orbit. We even have an image of it here. No, I don't. Looking at things like the natural range of the orbit, how the orbit changes in eccentricity, and the way that the orbit proceeds, like astrologers would know, the way that Aquarius is no longer in Aquarius. And at the same time, I'm trying to say, all of these things add up, and we can sort of map on and predict what we think what we think should be the result of temperatures on the planet based on all of these differences in the relationship of the Earth to the sun. The axial tilt changing, the axial precession, and the changes of the orbit. And it actually lines up really close to the kinds of temperature fluctuations we've been seeing. We know that back during the Eocene epoch and through the Oligocene, the temperature dropped due to a decrease in carbon. But then at the same time, you started to see the effects of glacier and interglacial periods, and they match up almost perfectly with what you would expect with a planet around a sun making big changes, until you get to the Holocene, which has been unusually stable. And there were some, the models would predict that we would have started creeping into an ice age over the last 10,000 years, and we haven't done that. There should have been an increase in glaciation in northern Canada, and we haven't seen that. And so the Rudiment Hypothesis says this. It says that there should have been a natural slight decline into the very beginnings of an ice age. But instead, early agriculture, and of a couple different kinds, including the polyculture horticulture systems that are present in most indigenous people all over the world, as well as, but much more so, things like rice agriculture, which created a huge amount of wetlands and methane production all over the planet, and the massive deforestation and the massive deforestation and agriculture of Europe and other parts of Eurasia. And so all of those things slowly released carbon into the atmosphere, right? And they kept the planet out of that glacial period. But now, of course, we're in a period where industrialization and all of our activities are just accelerating us way out of the picture. To me, this brings me a lot of hope, right? Because this tells us that these issues of soil and vegetation, these issues of the human impact on ecologies, they can make or break big differences in the landscape. Now, he also, this is the part that there's a question about if this is evidence or not of the hypothesis. But we see that there have been little dips, little periods of time where the temperature in the Holocene dropped and became cold again. We call them little ice ages. And they have always been connected closely with plagues, large plagues, Black Death, the intentional and massive spread of smallpox and other diseases with the American colonialism, American colonization, these huge tragic death periods. And there's always been a little bit of a cooling period at the same time. And the thought is that, does this come first or does it come after, right? Are we vulnerable to plagues during times that are cooler? Well, that doesn't really count for things like the spreading of smallpox in North America. And we don't know exactly, what's the cause and what's the effect. Well, with the Rudiment Hypothesis, the idea is that with the Black Death and with the plague, there were periods where people abandoned landscapes and they reforested as quick as they could. And that massive reforesting cooled the planet enough to be called a little ice age. So imagine if instead of a plague doing this, if we make intentional decisions to change our land uses, we could rapidly shift, maybe not a little ice age, but we could create a lowering of the extremes that we're having right now, and maybe even consider reversing some of these effects. Ratan Lal estimates that conservation agriculture could put enough carbon back into the soils to offset 5 to 15% of global fossil fuel emissions. And the Rodale Institute suggests that carbon sequestration in soils could fully offset fossil fuel emissions. So Ratan Lal is being very cautious and careful, and he's saying, I believe that if we put our minds to it, we could do this 5 to 15%, and it's more of a goal than it is necessarily like a measurement of what we do, because we could be accelerating things and we could be moving things even faster. And then here, the Rodale Institute is suggesting fully offsetting. I would argue that we don't need to stop there. We could just keep going. But we would need to be extraordinarily strategic in applying multiple different solutions. You can't just have one solution. Most of the studies out there about carbon sequestration focus on, what if we just planted alder trees? What if we just did this one soil technique? And the truth is that we have to find ways of doing many, many things at once. And I also feel a lot of hope in that we are already transforming and managing so much of the planet in ways that are degrading, that if we use that same energy, we could be making huge transformations. It's like one of the things right now is that I figured out, based on the FAO, the food organization with the UN, they said that garden agriculture has the capacity to basically outperform agriculture by 25 times. It's just that it requires somebody right there, right? It's right out the back door. It's a much more efficient use of land. It's just that each unit is not producing nearly as much. And so when we're talking about a global food system, you got to That we've made different decisions. But at the same time, we put huge amount of energy into our lawns. We move in the United States, the energy that we use just to pump water for lawns is equal to the amount of energy that we currently produce with nuclear energy. So all this nuclear energy that we have, it's all it's all going towards watering our lawns. So that's an incredible amount of energy. Imagine if we used that energy or that amount of energy for all sorts of causes, right? If we used it for the regeneration of soils, if we used it for taking care of agriculture in the form of gardening, we could be producing not all, but a lot of our food production close at hand. Now, all of this needs to be viewed in the context of reparation, appropriation, and decolonialism, right? And for me, these rules include things like we must undo harm and not replicate the past. We got here through an incredible amount of genocide and colonialism and oppression of working peoples. Joel says, my thread on lawns curses me during the summer. Yeah, that was a thread where I just went off and showed that we could take agriculture, put it into lawns, and use less energy than we're currently using and still be producing most of our stuff. However, in order to really do that, you have to have a grain staple, and we'll get to that in the second half of this presentation. So anyway, decolonialism and appropriation. We have to undo harm, right? That's what reparations are about. We have to undo harm. We can't just pretend that the past harm hasn't happened. It's there in the lives of real people. It's there in the situations on the planet. It's there in all the aspects of the world around us. So unless we decolonize, literally through our actions, not just through nice speeches, right? And we also have to be careful about the fact that so much of what we know about how to repair the planet is literally just the work that other people were maintaining for millennia, right? Every single landscape, for the most part, most landscapes were occupied during the southern moving climatic shifts that came out of the Ice Age, right? So where I am right now, people were here as salmon were reintroduced to the rivers. So people preceded the salmon, right? Their culture and the fish and the management of those ecosystems happened simultaneously. And I hear people be like, that's this sort of honoring or over romanticizing. And I'm like, literally, there are ecosystems that people were living in and managing. They are there, right? So there's many examples that we use that come from indigenous peoples and colonized cultures. And so we have to acknowledge that. We have to just acknowledge that these ideas are old ideas and that a lot of colonizing cultures lost this knowledge, stopped using it, oppressed themselves in their own communities and wiped it out, or thought that something was better because it moved energy and exploited others quicker. So we have to acknowledge and cite those use rights and where our ideas come from. And for the most part, wherever you are, it's a good idea to ask permission and to really recognize that we live in a world of intellectual property. We live in a world where we honor a lot of discovery. We honor a lot of the first person to name a thing, the first person to get that on paper. Let's recognize that most of this knowledge had use rights and had rules associated with it. So we got to ask permission and also accept when that permission isn't granted. So, as always, somebody says hydroelectric dams that displace indigenous land-based cultures offset less carbon than the communities that they're displaced. I mean, that's right. We know that 80% of biodiversity is currently being maintained by indigenous populations. It makes no sense not to restore use rights, decision-making, veto power, co-management. There's many different models out there that maybe are a little bit better for transition, and they need to happen because literally we're not managing the planet right and we're taking it apart too fast. Okay, so I'm interested in beech family plants, and one of the reasons for this, I just want to introduce that that chestnuts live in a larger community of related species. And these include the beeches. These include the oaks. They also include things like chinkapins. And they're incredible plants. They've been these massive trees that have taken care of ecosystems for a long time. Most of them radiated and separated around the same time as the dinosaurs, right, in the Cretaceous. And the separation of the different kinds of beech family trees was already completely done by the time that they were all living in the Arctic together. And so those ancient Arctic hardwood forests had to make the retreat during the ice ages down into the continents. And that retreat lost a lot of plants and species along the way, and we're now in the ecosystems as they've made it to the south. And as the planet heats up, they're going to have to start marching their way back north again. Chestnuts have been in almost every one of those ecosystems. So here is where that family of trees live. They're everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. And they're in incredible groups with each other. Now, all of these forests, like I said, not that long ago in their own histories, were all located up in the Arctic as a single forest. And this band has had to move south as the climate got colder. And we know that there are chestnuts that used to live in huge populations in the eastern part of the United States. There are chestnuts all over Europe and the Middle East. There are chestnuts all over China and Japan. And then there are other kinds of beech family trees that live in Southeast Asia. So this is a tree family that has seen each other in different arrangements throughout, ecological history. And they have been an important part of feeding animals. They've been an important part of holding onto soils. They've been an important part of interacting and maintaining healthy environments for all of the other plants. And this is the location where the chestnuts are currently. These are the current locations of chestnuts. And we've got a couple species here in China. We've got the species that are in Korea and Japan. We have species that are prominent to Western Europe, and the species that are at different places in the eastern United States, as well as there's also a couple chinkapins that live in the Pacific Northwest. And I would argue that this used to be a lot bigger. There were native chestnut stands here in the Middle East. And actually, there still is a huge production. Turkey is the world's largest producer of chestnuts. But also Egypt claims to be have some of the most delicious chestnuts in the world and has a long tradition of chestnuts being part of their food. For those of you that have been reading Graeber's recent book, what's it called? The Dawn of Everything. The focus of that book is that we can go back to places like Catalhayok, and that the food systems there were not actually that much grain-based. They were focused on, well, he says oaks and hazelnuts. But the truth is that when you look at the pollen of oaks, it's almost identical to chestnuts and can be really hard to determine if the pollen is chestnut or oak. I would argue, based on the location and the time and how hard oaks are compared to how easy chestnuts are, that these people were probably eating chestnuts in those scenarios as well. Every place that there's chestnuts, people enjoy them, and they have food and culture and celebration. And they make pasta, they make bread. And it's only during larger globalization, trade, and pressures to cut down forests that these things start to go away. And here they are. Here's the different kinds of chestnuts and where they're found. So I didn't realize I had this slide, but this is basically Earth history compressed. Here's the Holocene, relatively stable. Pleistocene was the last ice ages, and it's super cold. Pliocene was last epoch, and then we had a huge period of many, many, many different ups and downs during that. Much longer period of time here too. And the Eocene was this peak temperature, back when everything was in the Arctic. And they're zooming into the Holocene itself as it's been dipping into another ice age and now shooting up. Oh, so here we go. Here's the cycles of the planet and the way that they influence those things. Okay. So I'm excited in my work by a lot of deep time history, and I'm always really excited about the Eocene in general, because it is sort of the birthplace of our forest systems. And if we look at this period, right, back when it was that hot, up in the early Eocene, and then it dropped. And so there's always this question of like, well, why did it drop? Well, this is what the Northern Hemisphere looked like during the Eocene. The continents were much farther to the north, and so they squeezed and created an edge around the Arctic Ocean. And it meant that, other than these little straits coming through Europe and Asia, North America, this was a relatively isolated body of water, and so it did not have circulations. And it didn't have circulation, and so it was actually fairly stagnant, very similar to like what we think of as like the Black Sea now. And rivers in this environment poured into the Arctic and created a freshwater layer on top. So this was a temperate, like heaven. You know, this was really like a beautiful place in the Eocene, a place that we would have really liked to call home, except for it had really, really long winters that never completely froze. They were more like the winters in New England, but they never got much colder than that because the planet was so hot that in general, large-scale circulation kept things warmer. So when we go up there and we actually dig and look, there is fossil ferns in a layer compressed under the Arctic Ocean. Oh, I guess I didn't go too much detail into this as I thought. But so one of the things that happened is we know that there was a massive explosion of Azolla in that area. And Azolla has the ability, it's a little fern with a microbe attached to it that can fix nitrogen. And so in the right conditions, which is like not being in direct sunlight at mild climate and having opportunity to be in fresh water with a little bit of nutrients, this thing took over the Arctic Ocean every year and sequestered 80% of the Earth's CO2 over that time and dropped the climate down. We don't have a lot of conditions like that right now where we could have that happen, other than maybe the Great Lakes, which are polluted with phosphorus and could use an organism that would rapidly clean them, while also sequestering carbon that could be used as compost material to rebuild the soils of the Midwest. But this, again, is another example of the ways that biology can control climate. I think that that's something that we need to understand, is that biology literally can control climate. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to do monoculture stands of trees or gigantic Azolla-only systems. We need to have an integrated approach that uses multiple techniques simultaneously and takes advantage of the benefits of all of them. So we formed, out of sort of like inspiration from all of this stuff, we formed a nonprofit called BuildSoil. We're focused on promoting and inspiring collaborative soil improving solutions where people live. So community together, working together, we can actually make change and transformation. What we do ourselves is we have this pilot project where we're focused on chestnuts, like really focused on chestnuts. And we're hoping to get 1 million chestnuts planted in a reasonable time frame in the next few years. And have these chestnuts growing in residential areas and beginning to build community first around the planting of them, and then around the sharing of them, and then around the celebrating of them and the harvest of them and the cooking of them. And it's not the only thing that'll change the world. Like literally it's a starting place. So we start with chestnuts, and then from there we have teams that are capable of doing other things, and we have efforts that are capable. But chestnuts open up a number of rare opportunities, and I'll be going into that here. And we will be moving on to other kinds of examples of community solutions for climate change. Azolla is one that we're really excited about just because of its incredible ability to fertilize and make changes quickly. But also just really advocating for changes in design of land that hold water and improve these sort of soil building processes in general. Now, people ask me why chestnuts all the time, and there's a lot of issues here. So people who follow my account will sometimes repost saying chestnuts are this amazing carbon sequestration. Well, the truth is chestnuts are good carbon sequestration, right? They're old, big trees that grow fast. They have dense wood. They are especially suited, as trees go, for the sequestration of carbon. And you can plant them close together. How can we find followers of yours in our own communities? Well, if you look over here on our we have a Discord, and I've made a little QR code that you can access. If anybody wants to actually like get that QR code and put the link here, you're welcome to use that. I just don't happen to have the link ready to copy and paste. But on our Discord, it's organized around the big issues, and it's a discussion group. But it also, and we're having movie nights and stuff like that. But in our Discord, we've also organized ourselves around ecoregions, which may or may not be appropriate for chestnuts, and people can get together with other people, both in their town level and in their ecoregion level, and begin to plan and plot how we're going to do this work. So beech family trees, they just are this essential part of Northern Hemisphere ecosystems. They are everywhere, from the oak savanna of where I live here in Oregon or down in California. Multiple species of oaks that have a wonderful relationship with grasslands. Oaks have an incredible relationship with cows and deer and browsing animals, as do chestnuts. But they've also been, this is funny, I said annual production for centuries. I didn't mean annual, I meant perennial production for centuries. So people have been involved with chestnut food systems in Italy, Corsica, Korea, China, Eastern US, as well as Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. These are a food system that people have been eating forever. And so their quality is a lot more like a grain than a nut. When they're dried, they are a perfect flour for pasta, bread, and desserts. But in the fall, when you harvest them, you can cut them open, steam them, roast them, and they can be transformed and used like potatoes, or they can be made into bread. They can be sweetened. Some of them are sweet. So there's an incredible food. So they can replace a lot of grain annual agriculture. Now, I'm not saying we should replace all of grain annual agriculture. I'm into polyculture. So thank you. Joel just posted the Discord. I'm into polycultures, and we should be doing a lot of things at once. But the idea that we could be diversifying our food supply while also reducing our impact on grasslands is really what it does for me. So if we can give a huge amount of our landscapes the ability to be restored for their ultimate function as soil builders, we have the ability to make a lot of food in our own places, and chestnuts allow for a lot of that. Yeah, I don't know if I have time to answer this many questions. I'll have to think about your question and if we're similar or not. So 2 chestnut trees can produce as much as the USDA annual recommendation for grain nutrition is for a person. So a person's supposed to eat so much grain according to their structure, and 2 chestnuts can produce that when they're at maturity. So a chestnut per person would produce half of the grain equivalent nutrition that a person needs a year. And it's a staple crop with room underneath, right? So it can produce the same per unit area as a cornfield. But I can't have a cornfield in my urban front yard and really produce very much. And I can't do very much once. If I do devote every square inch or my park to a cornfield, it can't be a park anymore, right? It can't do other things. But if you have chestnut trees, they have a trunk, and they take up an area of the sky, and they produce grain up there, and we can have other types of things going on underneath. So in cities, that can include streets and yards and houses and living. It can also put other kinds of plants like hazelnuts and berries. They can also, because they're so compatible with native ecosystems, they can be an edible overstory. And then we can be doing native plant restoration underneath. So there, let me talk about a case study that I'm interested in that's not about chestnuts, but it's about mesquite, which is an incredible food supply down in the Southwest, especially Tucson. I'm interested in the idea that mesquite could be planted in Los Angeles. So we can directly feed people to support other creative and community efforts, right? So if we plant chestnuts, if we plant corn, we have to do it every year. We have to maintain it every year. There's lots of losses that can happen, and every community that's supporting those crops, and we should, is having to put a huge amount of energy in order to sustain itself. You're doing subsistence agriculture. But if we can be planting once, and a tree can live, the oldest chestnut tree in Europe is somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. So chestnuts are capable of being incredible food supply that can last consistently for long periods of time. I've been talking to a lot of people from chestnut communities in Spain and Italy, and I've noticed that a number of people who have family plots that are chestnuts that they harvest every year, they've never planted a chestnut tree. because all the trees that they harvest from were planted generations before. These trees keep feeding people. So it lasts for 1,000 years. We plant it once, we keep taking care of it. And all over the world, this has been done by cooperatives, group actions, collectives, feasts, and festivals. The chestnut process is pretty basic. You collect or buy them. I bought 12,000 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, and we planted them out, and I'll show you some pictures of that planting out. So we planted out 12,000 chestnuts, and we got 10,000 trees from it. It's a pretty good rate of success. And we planted them really close together, only a couple inches apart in dense beds. And that made it very easy. It's the best way to get the spiky part. They usually fall off out of the husk, or you could use your shoe. I use a chestnut roller. Most chestnut types don't maintain the spiky. It falls off, and you can also just smear it with your shoe, and it'll come off, and you can grab the chestnut. So then the next phase is you do these dense. You have to store them once you get the chestnuts. So people use the term stratification, but I don't tend to use that term because seeds that are stratified are ones that need a process to grow. There's seeds like I'm growing carob right now, and I have to stratify that in like, a strong acid or actually like rub it in order for it to sprout. But chestnuts will sprout the minute that they can. Actually, the problem that we have is trying to stop chestnuts from sprouting too early so they don't get frozen. So you put them in sand or coconut coir and you keep it damp in a plastic bag in your fridge, or you bury buckets that have holes punched in them and you cover it with like a mulch so that it can stay in the ground at about the ground level temperature throughout your frosty winter. Maintaining those cool temperatures and checking on them, making sure they're not molding. That's what you do over the winter. You could try planting them early too, and I've done experiments with that, and some do come up. But you harvest a lot of chestnuts. Let's get them going so you can plant them in the spring. Then in the spring, you get together with your friends. You get a few beds together, a 4x4 chestnut bed, just like 4 feet, and raised bed could hold 25 chestnuts for that first year. And then while these chestnuts are growing, we are looking for places for them to go. So here in Portland, they can be in street trees. Some cities allow for street tree chestnuts, some don't. Maybe you decide that you're going to start a campaign and work on those issues. And then, but also church groups, schools, mosques, community centers, your neighbors. The list is pretty endless of people that could have 1 or 2 chestnuts and benefit from the food production, and maybe would be interested, especially if they're concerned about the little bit of mess that happens in October from the husks. Maybe they'd be interested in being part of a cooperative where people come and harvest and clean. We have a couple people that I've been harvesting from who we make sure we bring a rake and take care of some of the husks, which actually compost very quickly and become really nice soil. And they feel great about giving us like a lot of their nuts because we're doing so much labor. So you got to find places, homes, yards, street trees, and permitting, other private sites, land trusts, religious sites. There's a movement of progressive communities of faith out here that has this vision of Paris groves, the Paris Accords, where there were agreements around climate change, and they're trying to form groves on church and church member properties. So we can be having beautiful trees, beautiful places underneath, and growing food. So, good. I'm glad to hear that this has been useful. I decided to do this sort of like overview of the process, and we can go into detail in the future and have good videos and more detail. So also looking at other private sites, looking at religious sites. And so I want to take a second. I have a lot of people who tell me they're allergic to chestnuts, and I've got two things to say about that. One is you might be allergic to chestnuts, so be aware of your allergies. But the second one is chestnuts are not tree nuts. And so if you're allergic to tree nuts, you may not be allergic to chestnuts. There doesn't appear to be a statistical, like, one is the other, right? However, I can't say whether you have more allergies than just tree nuts. And so if you are concerned about allergies, take the precaution you would take with any new food. Just know that it's not the same thing as the center as an almond or as a... Do I know about street trees in PDX? Chestnuts are big trees, and so you have to go through what's called like the large tree permitting process, and it requires a parking strip of 6 feet or wider. If it's smaller than that, then it's not appropriate. You can plant chestnuts in your own yard, your own choice, but you have to work with the city on that. We're trying to figure out how to do group permits and make it a little bit more streamlined for people, but I haven't figured that process out yet. We might do an interview with the person who actually like campaigned and made chestnuts legal for street trees in Portland, because it's an interesting story. Chad Hunnell. But the other issue around allergies for chestnuts is almost every time that somebody tells me they're allergic to chestnuts, I've started getting interested in the question. So I just sort of interview them a little bit. And I'm like, okay, did it taste like soap? And they're like, yeah, it really tasted like soap. And then I'm like, well, what were your symptoms? And they're like, gastrointestinal. I felt really terrible. And it's like, okay, I know exactly what's going on here is you're eating horse chestnuts. Horse chestnuts are not related. They're not in the beech family. And they're related closely with soap nuts. You can take chestnuts and you can make detergent from them. People make natural detergent for washing clothes and stuff with it. So it's not great, and they don't taste that great, but you can leach them, and sometimes when you cook them, they can taste okay. I think if you leach them a lot, you can make bread with them, but that's not my thing, and I really don't recommend doing it without like really knowing what you're doing. So telling the difference between a chestnut and a horse chestnut is important. In Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, we have maps of all of the street trees, and volunteers made those maps. And so I've gone and looked at a lot of the trees that are listed. Is this a chestnut? Well, they're misidentified. A lot of horse chestnuts have been misidentified as edible chestnuts, and edible chestnuts have been misidentified as horse chestnuts. And there's a lot of places where you see horse chestnuts and edible chestnuts planted together. And I think what's going on there is communities or people are like, I want to plant another chestnut tree. There's a spot to plant a tree. And so they just put another tree called a chestnut next to the other tree, and they don't know that they're not related to each other. That can cause problems where squirrels are moving the nuts around. Yep, they're full of saponins. So the squirrels can move them around. I've had the experience of looking at the ground, and there is a horse chestnut, and I look up, and it's an edible chestnut tree. And if I didn't know the full identification, I might think, okay, I got it. I know that that's a chestnut tree. I know this probably is a chestnut. So knowing to be able to look around and see other trees and tell the difference between the nuts is really important. So with that said, this right here is an edible chestnut. It has a pointy bit, just like the emoticon of a chestnut. It has a pointy bit to it. Here's a horse chestnut. It's poisonous. It is round. It has no pointy bit. Here's an edible chestnut. It is covered with spikes that are thin and needle-like. Here's a poisonous horse chestnut. It is almost like, what's the tool called? It's almost like has spikes that are thick and farther apart from each other. So, edible, poisonous. Here are some poisonous chestnuts. They have multiple leaves all on one leaf, little leaflets. They have far apart spikinesses that resemble Bowser from Super Mario Brothers. They are round, and they have usually this shape and this color of a white area. A mace, thank you. Yes, horse chestnuts look like a mace, while edible chestnuts look like a hedgehog or a pincushion or a sea urchin. Here is an edible chestnut. It looks like a koosh ball. These are edible chestnuts. They have spikes that are needle-like, and they've got pointy bits at the end. These are edible chestnuts. This is an edible chestnut. It has a single leaf with a serration to it, and it has spikes that look like needles. This is an edible chestnut. This is a poisonous chestnut. It has mace-like husks that have spikes that are far apart and are kind of like small. And it has leaves that are complicated leaves with many leaves coming out of one spot. So I've learned a lot about chestnuts from Mark Shepard, and I recommend his book, Restoration Agriculture. He has been doing an incredible work of breeding ecologically diverse, complex communities of multiple species and varieties that are capable of adapting to climate change. And he's been using that to adapt for far northern varieties of chestnuts. He's trying to grow chestnuts in Wisconsin, in places that historically have not been used for chestnut agriculture. And he's moving a lot of stuff and creating incredible food resources for the future. I recommend New Forest Farm as a source. They have high quality nuts and high quality trees. They're pretty cool. I'm not connected with them, but I just recognize that they philosophically have a breeding program that I agree with. And we just recently had a big loss. Mark's son, who was also involved in restoration agriculture, has passed away recently. So his work is incredible, and I recommend reading his book. Another person I recommend, who somebody in the chat brought up, is Kiva Silver, Twisted Tree Farm, and he's doing dense plantings, very similar to what we're doing. And he does these massively dense plantings and then transplants them and hands them out. And he also is breeding incredibly diverse communities of chestnuts, so that you're not just having one type or one species, but that you're giving many kinds of trees the opportunity to express themselves in your seed bank, so that as disease and climate change and other issues come through. I highly recommend his book, Trees of Power, which also talks about other trees other than chestnuts. So here's what we do. We put them in sawdust in buckets. We bury it. This is from Akiva Silver. And I'm inspired by the work of desert harvesters down in Tucson, who do community plantings in the parking strip of mesquite, and they harvest mesquite pods together. And then they have pancake breakfasts and food, and they have a community hammer mill that they use for making flour. So people all over Tucson are joining together in a network of people harvesting mesquite. And we want to, with BuildSoil, we want to extend this and have this work also happening in other places that can handle mesquite, and to take the same philosophy of community orchards and community food production and doing that right where we live, starting with small little beds, planting 25 or so in a tiny little bed in your yard, connecting with friends and neighbors, finding groups to distribute those trees to, and getting out there and getting 1 million chestnut trees planted and other trees as well. Here's the Desert Harvesters mobile mill, where they have their community harvest and flower party, but they also have a gigantic mill that's available to anyone that plants a tree and joins with their network. Yeah, carob is a great plant too. I'm planting carob in Oregon so that it'll be big by the time that we're having desert environment here. Mesquite is an incredible food with an incredible legacy of indigenous plant breeding and maintenance, and a lot of the varieties we have are only here because they're currently managed by people whose families have been managing them for hundreds and hundreds of years. It is a diverse food with a lot of taste. It's very sweet, and it makes really good desserts, and it's incredibly nutritious. And the Desert Harvesters community is in a place with a lot of different kinds of food traditions. You know, it's a convergence site of many different native cultures and also European cultures, and it is amazing food. So they have this incredible cookbook of recipes from older people and younger people and chefs and grandmothers, and they're an incredible organization and nonprofit, and I recommend their book as well. And we are, in awe of their work with BuildSoil. So we want to replicate and take what they've done and bring it to chestnuts. And they have these wonderful events, mesquite milling and fiestas, and they also have pancake breakfasts and delicious meals together. So I'm inspired here where I live in temperate environments, and you saw all the places that oak family, beech family trees live, by chestnuts. So this is a chestnut tree in a cemetery. A lot of the beautiful chestnut trees in the Pacific Northwest are in cemeteries. And there's many different species that are all living together. There's Chinese and European and some American chestnuts, because we don't have the blight out here. And there's mixes of them. And these trees are incredibly beautiful trees, and they produce an incredible amount of food. And if you go to any park, whether it's a cemetery or whether it's just a regular park, you will find in October in the early morning grandmothers from China and Korea, Japan, from Eastern Europe, from Italy, with flashlights, harvesting and collecting chestnuts to prepare for food, to make pasta, to make dumplings, to fry up. This is in Portland. So here's a chestnut tree that I really love. I love the flavor of it. And this is 1 hour of walking around and harvesting casually. And this production of chestnuts happens throughout, like any 2-hour period probably would produce this much from these 2 trees at any hour of the day for about 3 weeks. So you can see how very quickly 2 chestnut trees produces bags and bags and bags and bags of nuts that could be transformed into flour or frozen or milled. There's so many ways of processing them. So what we did, we had 12,000 chestnuts, and a lot of them we put into beds in backyards, but many of them we just put in buckets. And so here are often 30 chestnuts to a single bucket, holes drilled in the bottom, just a triple mix of compost, sand, and topsoil, just dirt that we got. So here's 30 in each of these beds, and they're sprouting. This is the backyard in Portland, a very basic place, setting up a pond, a little compost pile, and starting to lay down cardboard on top of the grass. And then moving soil on top of that. If you don't have soil in place, you can be building soil by bringing in all sorts of like leafy green material, leaves, a little bit of manure, and putting down cardboard and layering it with wood chips. We did that in other locations. Here's a couple inches of topsoil put on top and mixed in with the dirt. So then we went in and we planted chestnut trees. The chestnuts in this case are about that far apart, if that's like 6 inches. But in some places we've experimented with as close as 3 inches, and they've been just as happy. One thing about chestnuts is we do not want them to grow too big during this period because this is not their final location. And chestnuts drop from their trees all the time. In the understory of forests, chestnuts may wait, 100 years, 200 years for their parent tree to drop so that they can rapidly grow into fill the space. So chestnuts will not produce nuts in shade, but they will hang out in shade. And so we are intentionally growing them close together and with as much shade as possible in order to keep them small and happy, and then they can be transplanted into their final locations where they can grow big. We have had the example of people planting farther apart and in sun, and then digging them up can be really difficult. So wait until you know that you want the tree there. Another option, though, is if you know that you want 2 trees that are the proper distance, they should be about 25 feet apart, you can plant every 5 feet, right? So that when they're young, they sprout up and they're able to pollinate each other in 3 or 4 years when they're first flowering. And then you can go in and you can thin them as they get bigger. And so you keep thinning and thinning until finally the 2 left are going to be these big 25 feet apart chestnut trees. So that's a way to be growing a lot of trees, having a lot of pollen, having a lot of like biological opportunities for breeding, and also keeping things, as dense as possible. And here they are. These chestnuts were already sprouting in the fridge before we put them into the ground. And we just literally laid them down and tucked them in. And then in this case, we had some hoop houses, which I decided to use partially because we had a little bit of squirrel problem. But I've seen squirrel successes with just smaller hoops done with PVC pipe. I've done that myself. And also things like building little greenhouses or putting protection over them. Now you will have a little bit of a squirrel problem probably, but not all of them. So here's that garden bed with the first leaves coming up underneath the greenhouse. And here's a quick view of what my backyard looked like after that first planting, that first year. So we had 10,000 trees in total, including the buckets, and we've handed out 8,000 of them so far. We still have about 2,000 in the backyard. And so here's the same garden bed in the first year and then in the second year. These trees are dormant. We want to move them when they are the most dormant. So we wait for the leaves to come off, and we try to move them before they sprout too much. In this bed over here, I've drawn a square that shows, I believe, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I believe that this is 100 chestnuts. So I think that this square is 100. It might be a little bit more than that. So we're planting very dense together. So then we dug these up, and with the help of a bunch of volunteers, we moved them. Let's see, about 2,000 of them went up to communities around the Snohomish Reservation, and they've been moved to Native communities all over Western Washington. And then the other ones have been handed to church groups and communities of faith and neighbors and people that are interested in taking on growing community chestnuts. And here's some of the roots, and here's coming out of a bed. And here's me holding, I believe, 300 chestnut trees. No, I'm sorry. I think this one is 150. Imagine all of the forests that come out of that. And here's what our buckets look like when they were ready to be handed off to people. So all over the world, these chestnuts are celebrated in community events and festivals, and we aim to do the same. We've already had a couple little gatherings of, it's COVID, so we're being careful. Less than a dozen people, all pretty far apart from each other. But we want to get to the place like these Italian communities or places in Corsica where we have annual food production, annual celebrations. 1 million chestnut trees is a small amount, but in any community, a number of chestnut trees can be produced that feed people for part of the year, or it's a seasonal food. And then as we grow more, we can go wider and wider with that. So here's some more Chestnut Festivals. So that's our work. We're going to be presenting and teaching more about these activities, and this is just meant to be sort of an overview of why eat chestnuts, which is that ultimately we care about soil and community efforts to build soil, and there's many different ways to do that. But the way I've thought about this is that our job is I'm going to move to the main window. Yeah, our job is to be doing things that make an ongoing difference. And so plants have this amazing ability, and living things have this amazing ability that when they have their needs met and their limiting factors are provided for, they can grow exponentially. I mean, we've seen that with COVID, right? And when we align ourselves with biological solutions, with the basis and the foundation of the food web and the resource web, we can go from there. Now, chestnuts are also an incredible source of wood and fuel as well, and they can be part of coppice agroforestry. But they're not the only one, and there's an incredible amount of plants and other things that work with that. So we could be creating things that both mimic and also accelerate the transition to healthy ecosystems, while also providing human need, building community and capacity, learning how to work together, and eating and enjoying and doing a lot of good on the way. So I'm really looking forward to a future where we have planted chestnuts, right? So where we can get to that point where we're not actually needing to plant that many. There's 7 billion people, and some kind of food system could be put in place that maintains the basic needs that they have. And then we can be growing all the things that we want to trade and take care of. We can still have tropical fruits in the north. We can still have other kinds of production. But when we're talking about our basic production and our basic needs, there's no reason why every single place can't be providing a lot of its own needs as well. And that isn't so much self-sufficiency as community sufficiency and the ability to support each other. And that makes us stronger and able to reach out to other countries and other places and other people and be there with each other and connect with each other. So 1 million chestnuts is a first step, and let's get planting. If you want to join our Discord, we have a link that's already been put into the chat, but also this QR code is meant to get you there as well. and we can have more and more conversations about getting to work, finding people that we want to work with, actively planting, first in little beds in tiny little interstitial spaces in our yards, and then using that as a conversation starter. Hey, I've got 100 chestnuts growing in my yard. Would you be interested in taking them on? Let me tell you a little bit about this. And then starting to build more and more relationships that way. And then other foods, other resources. Okay, we got a question. Can I buy chestnuts from a grocery store and have a good chance of sprouting them? Now, maybe. No, it hasn't been addressed before. Maybe. So most chestnuts you're going to get in a grocery store have been irradiated. They've been heated at least to the point where they they're not going to germinate. There are a lot of chestnut diseases in the world, just like there's oak diseases. There is the blight, but there's also weevils and that kind of thing, right? And those usually get processed by heating them up or irradiating them. So stuff coming from China, there's a lot of rules for moving nuts across borders. Like for example, in the West Coast, we don't allow you to buy chestnuts from other parts of the country because of the risk of blight from other parts of the country. But everybody can buy from Oregon, Washington, California, simply because we don't have the blight. And the same thing's true for when chestnuts are imported. So you can give it a shot. I actually recommend with all these things, like literally just try it. Like you can buy 5 chestnuts and plant them and see what happens. So I would say go for it. I would also say that it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to just buy some chestnuts. Like you can buy a pound of chestnuts from most suppliers for about $10, and a pound is 30 nuts, and you can grow like 25 trees from that. So, but give it a shot. If you like the flavor of a nut, plant them. Somebody's asking if they can be used as livestock feed. Yeah, I mean, ungulates evolved in forests, right? So cows are basically big deer. They're a little bit more adapted for grasses, but they are browsers too. And pigs love chestnuts. They love acorns. The spikies aren't that big of a deal. I feel like the spikes are more of a deal to us because we literally are like want to pick up this big urchin. But animals have no problem with it. Like I said, most chestnuts split open, and a lot of varieties will actually just drop their nuts, and then the spikes fall next to them. Deer do love them. Actually, studies that have been show that the wildlife value of chestnuts. Yeah, I'm not advertising particular nurseries at this point, but we have a list on our wiki and soon on our website of every single chestnut supplier we could find. So the wildlife value of chestnuts is valued at like almost 100 times that of acorns because animals just love them. And the other thing is all of these delicious trees have to protect themselves somehow, right? So acorns protect themselves from squirrels and other animals by injecting their seeds with tannins, by making them unpalatable. And the only way to eat them is if you bury them or put them in a stream. So squirrels bury them and then come to them later when they've been leached. And the other way that oaks deal with these things is they have what's called a mast year. They produce a ton of nuts all at once, but before the population of their seed thieves gets too big, they have a couple years of not producing very much, and that wipes everybody out. Chestnuts have taken a different strategy. I mean, they literally will produce crops every single year. They've got heavy years and light years, but it's not like oaks. And so their strategy instead, and they also keep their nut incredibly edible and sweet, and they don't bother filling it with tannins. So their strategy is dump the nuts and cover them in a thick mat of spiky material. And all the animals have definitely figured out how to deal with it. Watching squirrels handle chestnuts is amazing. They are so good at it. So I've been talking now for almost an hour and 40 minutes. If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. But what I encourage you all to do is join in. We can get a lot of trees planted in a really short amount of time. We can plant a ton of trees and then move on to other things, other projects. This doesn't have to be an ask for the rest of your life, right? This could be something that we do over the next 2 years as a first project, as we try to find many different ways of responding to the climate crisis, and also just build our capacity to be directly connected with food supplies in our own communities. And who even knows, in like 10 years, 20 years, the kinds of festivals and celebrations and food supplies that are going to start in our own backyards and will allow us to be resilient during pandemic or food shortages or, conflict, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I look forward to meeting you all again in this stream and on our Discord and in other spaces. And I hope everybody has a great night. Thanks for being part of this. Oh, one more thing. Does anybody have a raid recommendation? We can totally find another. We can totally find another. I'm new to Twitch, so I don't know who else are the like eco people or the people who are like talking about cool things. So if anybody has a recommendation for people to raid, I'm open to recommendations. Oh, and please subscribe, because we actually are now affiliates and we can take subscriptions. And if you don't want to subscribe, please just follow, and you'll get alerts and stuff for this kind of thing. All right, no recommendations for raids. Someday I'm going to find some Twitch streamer that I really like that specifically works on these issues. Okay, good night, everybody.